All right. Start off with a piece of business. I told some people already. Next month is scheduled for March 19th. It's going to be the following week, March 26th, because I'm away March 19th. So that required us to change it, unless Gary wants to take over and do it.
Yeah.
I also want to make a generalized comment about what we're doing tonight. Um, we're looking at the World War One and how it formed and shaped the modern Middle East. But you know what? We're not only are we barely scratching this topic, but when we look at next month is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire.
Mm.
So that's the story of World War One. The month after that is 30 years of genocide, and a large part of that is the story of World War One, the Armenian genocides that went on, and the following one after that is the British Mandate in Palestine. That's a story of the First World War also, and its consequences. And the last one this year, Inventing Iraq and the Failure of Nation Building, is also a story of World War One. My thesis tonight is World War One is important here. And we will be talking about it for the rest of this year in terms of what's going on. Um, I and I'm going to say something that I have to then qualify myself for saying. I'm going to say I think it is, if the purpose of all of these history forums on the Middle East is not to gain knowledge, but instead to try and understand how the Middle East became what the Middle East is, I think World War One is the most important event for understanding the modern Middle East. Now, I say that with qualifications because when we were talking about the discovery of oil, I said this might be the most important event in the history of modern Middle East. And when we were talking about the Theodor Herzl and the rise of Zionism, I said this might be the most important event in the history, in the shaping the history of the modern Middle East. So there's a lot of things that are really, really major events. And as I look at the schedule that I put out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a row are about World War One. I clearly think, even if I didn't say it to myself out loud, World War One is the most important event. World War One coupled with the 1919 Paris Peace Conference and what that did to reshape the Middle East. Those two together are, I think, what created the Middle East that we live with today. And so very important. The easy way to start off is to say, I'm going to do a two-part intro. First part is, what was the impact of World War One on the Middle East? And then I'm going to say, but that misses the point. You need to step back and get a wider camera lens, a wide angle camera lens, and say, what did World War One, how did it change the world? It is my belief, aside from this history forum, it's the most important event in the 20th century for world history. It is really that phenomenally important. It changed the world in ways that are almost, it's stunning that people were able to adjust to the kind of immense changes that happened. But let's look first at specifically, camera in close, at the Middle East. You see the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had ruled the Middle East for 400 years. They had been, however else we judge them in other aspects, a source of stability in that region. We knew who the bosses were. We knew how the world operated in there, and we knew that we could almost count on it. Now, there's qualifications in this, and we're going to get into those qualifications.
What years the collapse approximately beginning and end?
Collapse is going to be approximately 1917, 1918. It's the war in the Middle East, First World War, ends before the war on the Western Front, but not much before, and it collapses. It's almost an instantaneous thing. Once the war was over and they lost, they were done as an empire. And it's also this story is also about how the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire needed to modernize, and it's why they couldn't survive. What what Europe, Western Europe in particular, went through was the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution changed how we lived, how Europeans lived. And it created these great technologies for military purpose, for commercial purposes, etc. And the Ottoman Empire was left behind on those, did not participate in that, and therefore ended up behind economically in serious ways that just crippled the empire. The war was the final straw and brought them down. But when you bring down a system that had been in place for 400 years, it's a seismic change in that world. That's one thing. Two, anybody who's been to any of my history forum knows I talk about European imperialism. And if the Ottoman Empire is going to implode, somebody's going to come in to pick up the pieces. And it's going to be the British and the French. And they will have pretty much free reign to do what they want. I have mentioned a dozen times in these lectures or these discussions, I hope, the Sykes-Picot agreement, which is Britain and France talking about how they want to divide up the Ottoman Empire, how they want to divide up the Middle East. It was actually the Sykes-Picot, I'm going to get this wrong, Savronov, because originally Russia was part of the agreement. Because if you're going to divide up the world, you need all the world powers involved in it. And that would have been France and Britain and Russia. They would be the three main powers. A little thing like the Russian Revolution happens, and Russia is now out of the picture. So now it's just England and Great Britain and France that are going to do this dividing of the territory. So one, you've got the collapse of this 400-year ruling party, ruling empire. Then you've got the imperialists from France and Britain sweeping in to pick up the pieces, and literally redrawing the map of the Middle East. It almost sounds silly to say, one of the worst things, or that had a lot of negative impact on the world from the imperialist, whether you're going into Asia, whether you're going to Africa, wherever you're going, Middle East, is they drew lines on maps and created countries that made no sense. And Africa has paid the price for that with all these civil wars, et cetera, again and again and again. And the Middle East has paid the price for it. As an example, Iraq put together Kurds, Sunni Muslims, and Shia Muslims. They didn't belong together. They were enemies with each other. They're a country because it made sense economically and administratively for the British Empire to build them, to construct a country like that. And, countries are more often than not artificial constructs, but there are certain things that tie them together. And the British were not, again, we could go to the example of India and Pakistan. They drew a line, and the world has been paying the price for how they drew that line since 1947. I mean, it's just, somebody should have taken their pencils from them. Say, don't get into map making. Don't do that. Because what you do has consequences that you don't even imagine. And they're going to be terrible. Okay, so now we've got three things. We mentioned the Armenian genocides. World War I, with all of its violence, with its trench warfare, provided cover for this horrific massacre of Armenians to occur. I don't know if this is true. I read this years and years ago. I think I was in my 20s, and I haven't found it since. But a statement that said the Armenian genocide was the, quote, most successful genocide in history, defining success as it killed the highest percentage of that population. I don't know if that is true. It's a thing that I have had read a long, long time ago and haven't corroborated it since. But whether it is or not, it's a horrific, horrific, horrific event.
Yeah.
Okay. And if we think about the modern Middle East today, we have multiple thoughts, but the first one that comes to almost everyone's mind is the Arab-Israeli oppositions, animus for each other. And World War I set the stage for that, for the intensification of those oppositions. England is going to play games of, I'll promise the Arabs they can have self-determination. I'll promise the Jews they can have a homeland here. And not promising once, but multiple times to each side and breaking the promises to both and leaving both sides furious at England and at each other. And I mean, for instance, the Balfour Declaration is probably the strongest political statement in favor of the existence, the creation of a Jewish homeland. But if you read the Balfour Declaration, it says two things. One, we view with favor and will do what we can to assist the Jews to form a homeland in Palestine. And then ... a sentence later, as long as it does not prejudice the existence, the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities already living there. You can't do them both. It was 1917. And it was, yes, it was the promise upon which Zionist Jews placed their faith that they would be able to create a homeland in Palestine. And again, we're going to end this talking about how the British response to this mess is to make it a bigger mess. But that's one of my prejudices. All right. That's here if we got the close in angle looking at the Middle East. Last month, we were talking, one of the great fears of the European powers was an upset to the balance of power in the world. Because if you upset the balance, it might work in your favor, it might not. And therefore, maintaining the status quo. And for more than a century, the Ottoman Empire had been called the dying man of Europe. Because they were dying, because they, on their own, they would collapse. They would have collapsed long before World War I. The European powers kept them afloat because they thought if the Ottoman Empire collapses, there's a vacuum. The Russians are going to come in, the French are going to come in, the British are going to come in, and how it turns out is not guaranteed. And right now, status quo is better for us than a potential future. Potential future might be better. We might get more power, but we don't know. And that's scaring us. Well, if you want to, I'm going to back off that for 1 second. What did World War I do in terms of its effect on the world? It introduced us to mechanized war, and it introduced us to trench warfare, and it introduced us to, I'm going to use a loaded word here, to the normalization of holocausts. Holocaust not meaning specifically as it is applied to what happened to the Jews in World War II, but just slaughters in numbers that just don't make sense to any human imagination.
Mass killing.
Yeah. And to put it into perspective, there were estimated 20 to 25 million casualties in World War I. The largest war in the 19th century was in terms of casualties, was the Franco-Prussian War with 250,000. The scalar difference from 250,000 to 25 million, it is mind-blowing is a kind of a silly word to use. It just, you cannot make sense of that if you are living in that. And it's kind of a psychic shock. The generation that comes out of World War I were labeled the lost generation because they had lost faith in God, faith in institutions, faith in countries, faith in leaders, faith in almost everything. There's a story about the Battle of the Somme, which was fought twice, and each time there were 1 million casualties. Again, the largest war in the 19th century had 250,000. This battle, fought twice, had 1 million each time. There was one particular general, I do not remember his name. It's from a book called, I got the story from a book called War in Modern Memory. And there was a general who he had 75,000 men, and he sent them to march in to take down a machine gun encampment. Well, that's a suicide mission. That's not doable. And of his 75,000 men, 60,000 were killed. I want you to picture what those 15,000 returning soldiers felt about that general, and about all generals, and about all leaders, and about everything that's going on in the world. This battle will be refought. Same general does the same thing again. Sends 75,000 men into a machine gun encampment. 60,000 are killed. It's not just the deaths. It's the senseless of it. It's the inability to say there was a reason for this. There was a rationale for this. There was a purpose for this. It's 120,000 kids dead. And you add to that, maybe they had two parents. Maybe they had a wife or a girlfriend. Maybe they had 6 or 8 or 12 friends. The number of people who are impacted by that one general's actions, and that's a psychic shock to Western Europe nations. Okay, so you got that. Now we want to talk about balance of power. We'd like things to be stable. We'd like things to stay the same. In World War I, literally 3 empires that had existed for hundreds of years, providing anchors for that stability of the balance of power, disappeared. The Russian Empire collapses. The Austro-Hungary Empire collapses.
And the Ottoman.
And the Ottoman. And the Ottoman Empire collapses. Look, 3 empires gone.
And
Three.
and the German, basically.
Yeah, well, and 3, yes, and 3 dynasties disappear. The Hohenzollerns, who were basically in Prussia, the Habsburg, who were in Austria, and the Romanovs. I mean, these were institutions that you expected to go on forever, and really had provided, with all their other problems, and there are much to complain about with all these empires, they provided stability and in a sense that you knew tomorrow how the world was going to work. Well, you're coming out of this World War I not knowing, and that's only what's on the surface. I think World War I is also responsible for the end of the French Empire, the end of the British Empire. It's going to start.
Mike,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just one question. So are you saying that your belief is that the Russian Empire collapsed because of World War I rather than the Russian Revolution?
There's connective tissue here. Why did the Russian Revolution happen? In World War I, Russia was suffering catastrophic casualties. They were also going through famine and starvation. Their food and fuel supplies were wiped out, and the people started to riot and protest. This isn't the communist Bolshevik revolution. What happens first is the people start to riot and protest and scream, and the government tries to be repressive, and ultimately they overthrow that government. But it is all directly linked to what happened in Russia's participation in World War I. Do I think if Russia had not participated in World War I, there would not have been an overthrow and a murder of the Tsar? I do.
Really?
Now, at some point, there might have, but the urgency and immediacy of it was a direct result of how the Russian people were suffering in World War I. The deaths, the number of casualties was beyond being unacceptable. The starvation, everything that was the lack of fuel, they could not function as a country, and ultimately they would collapse. So you are right. The Russian Empire collapses because of the Russian Revolution. Now, mind you, there's a period between murdering the Tsar and the Bolsheviks taking over. It's not the Bolsheviks who overtook the Tsar. The Russian people did. And then the Bolsheviks came in and formed a government. But do I think it is directly a result of Russian participation in World War I? I absolutely do. I don't think it would have happened in 1917, very big year, if World War I had not been the ongoing catastrophe around the world. So yeah, you are right to point to the Russian Revolution, but I think it is a consequence. It is an immediate consequence of World War I. Okay.
Got it.
Now, I was saying that it also is responsible for ending the British Empire and the French Empire. And this is ahead of the point, but I'm going to get to it now anyway, and we'll revisit it. Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War One in the peace conference, issues his 14 points. One of them was everybody, all peoples of the world should have the right to self-determination. Those words have resonance. And the citizens in the colonies held in thrall by Britain or France or whatever empire it might be, the Portuguese, it doesn't matter. They're hearing these words and they're saying, yeah, that's right. Especially since in order for Britain to fight the war, they didn't have enough soldiers. So they were pulling Indian soldiers in. They were pulling in soldiers from the various colonies that they held. And they were taking resources from those countries too. They could not have fought the war without all the resources they got from their colonies. And I would make an analogy between Black soldiers who fought in World War One and came home and said, the old ways are not going to continue. We are not going to accept a second-class citizenship. We just fought to save democracy. We just fought to keep the world free. And you're telling us we have to go back to the Jim Crow kind of South? No way in hell we're going to do that.
But the same thing happened World War II.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. Absolutely.
2 decades later, no changes.
But, well, I'm not going to say no changes. What I'm going to say is there's a process. What happened immediately after World War One? About a year later, the Irish War for Independence starts. First crack in the empire, and Mahatma Gandhi had been already fighting for the freedom, the separation of India from the British Empire. But his movement gained enormous strength. It will take till 1947 till it is completed, but it is beginning here post-World War One. Post-World War One, with Wilson's one of his 14 points saying people should have the right of self-determination. Those words are having impact. They're not immediate, but pretty damn close. Ireland, by 1922, a bulk of that country is now free from the British Empire. Egypt has a revolution. They had been under the thrall of the British since about 1880. By 1922, they're free. They end the protectorate. The pieces are happening. And then you will see the French go through the same thing in Indonesia and Algeria and other places. You will see the Portuguese go through it too. The ending of these European empires is not an instantaneous accomplishment of World War One, but the process is put in place. And again, these changes are not minor changes in how the world is operating. These are gigantic, seismic changes. And then, of course, as Gary brought up, the Russian Revolution is going to happen. Well, if we're arguing for our list of the top 10 events that shaped 20th century history, that revolution's on it. And that's just one part of what the World War One did to change the world. Make a kind of a statement. The 20th century didn't begin until World War One. 1913 is just an extension of the 19th century. But in the graveyards and battlefields of Verdun, of Gallipoli, of the Somme, that's where the 20th century was born. And it's a century of horrors. Eric Hobsbawm wrote a book called The Age of Extremes, A History of the 20th Century. And one of statistics, sometimes we hear them and we don't get any reality out of them. But for this one, it does for me. In terms of wars and other atrocities, 180 million people were killed in the 20th century. That throws in things like Pol Pot's genocide and all kind. I'm not talking about murders on the street or whatever. I'm talking about government organized clashes or atrocities. And here comes somebody else. And again, that's, if you go back to that number from the 19th century, the Franco-Prussian War, about 250,000 casualties. And then say in the 20th century, 180 million is our guess. In the colonial adventurism into Africa, basically in a 20-year period from 1880 to 1900-ish. There will be, the estimate is, because we didn't count, 18 to 20 million Africans killed. But that happened kind of off stage. We were not, I'm getting a view here, excuse me, see. Am I getting her in? And I don't know if she wants to get in twice. No, she doesn't. All right. Hi, Jackie. Again, people who grew up in the 20th century, which is most of us here.
We all did.
That shaped, these events continued to shape our lives, and our attitude, and how we approached, how we look at politics, how we look at government, how we look at everything. And again, I just want to say, this is the big picture as to what. Yeah, Jackie, I think you're on twice is the problem.
Yeah, Mike, I think you need to drop one of them.
Okay.
At any rate, if we think about these earthquakes, and these are all, each event I've talked about is a mammoth earthquake, and we think that they didn't have reverberations in the Middle East, of course they did. If we look at, not even through yet, World War I and the peace conference, the peace treaty, create the seeds for World War II. And Hitler's anti-Semitic hatred of Jews, I guess that's redundant. Yeah. Part of it comes out of his saying, the Jews betrayed us in World War I. Again. Yeah. And if we say, oh, God, 20 to 25 million casualties in World War I, World War II, there were over 50 million. And World War II introduced us to, we got to get the bigger, best, fastest, strongest, most powerful bomb in the world, the atomic age, the nuclear age right around the corner. Absolute.
How or why did Hitler think the Jews betrayed the Germans in World War
I? I don't believe he ever gave an explanation. His basic, and Matthew, it looked like you have an idea if you want to chip in. But his basic idea is there's no way the superior German race could have lost. It had to be a betrayal. And it was Bolsheviks and Jews, and a lot of Jews were Bolsheviks. So when you look at what Hitler's rage in World War II, his treatment of Russian soldiers, Soviet soldiers, was much more brutal than it was of if the armies captured any others. They hated the Bolsheviks. That's why that agreement they came to early before in the war where the Russians and Germans were going to be allies was stunning to the world. It didn't last long. It couldn't last long because they both hated each other. But yeah,
to what you said, yeah, it was basically Hitler claimed that the German soldiers fighting on the front lines were betrayed by elites and politicians back in the boardrooms of Berlin. And it's called the stab in the back myth, the myth that Germany would have won if only the politicians hadn't forced them to retreat, which is not true, of course. And he blamed the Jews as part of the elite cabal.
Yeah, you said it better than I did. That's very good. That's exactly it. And if we're talking about the balance of power in the world order, by the time you get to the end of World War II, and I think this is all a chain that you can't almost take the pieces apart, Britain and France are not world powers. It's the Soviets and the Americans. And the whole, to be a person who grew up in England early in the 20th century, and then to face a world in 1957 or 58, say post the Suez debacle, all of a sudden, England, who has this grandiose idea, we're a small island, but we're the greatest, we were the greatest power on earth, and shouldn't we still be? They're not. They don't, they only matter because we're polite. And that's a change that they could not imagine. And again, I think you can hear it in my voice. I think World War One, if we want to understand the world we live in, we start by understanding World War One, and then we work our way forward. And World War One is the scariest story. I think if you want to tell a horror story, World War One is the horror story to tell in terms of modern history. Are there double the amount of casualties in World War II? Yes. Is the machinery, the technology, the mechanized war machinery much greater, much more powerful? Yeah. But that's almost a logical extension of what you would assume would happen. We got this good at it in World War One. Now in World War II, we're going to be better. And that's the way the world went. Okay. All right. Now I want to get to looking back to the Middle East, and I want to look at the Ottoman Empire. By the way, next month is on the fall of the Ottoman Empire. I'm giving them very short shrift this month. And again, just to let everybody know, things I said last month, I'm going to repeat here. Things I say next month are going to be repetitions of what I'm saying here. These are all interrelated events, and you come at them from different angles, but they're all together. Okay, so the question is, what was the Middle East like under Ottoman rule in the pre-war years? Well, the Ottoman Empire was the dying man of Europe, which meant their authority was weak. Certain imperial protocols and infrastructures were still in place. They collected taxes, they did things, but their ability to control their subjects was very, very weak.
Well, you could say that, but to some degree that was also intentional, because one of the reasons it survived as long as it did is because they gave different ethnic and religious communities autonomy. And arguably that helped prevent them from rebelling as vehemently.
And it hits on another theme, Matthew, which is we tend to have to look at the Ottoman Empire more than we did say at the British Empire, because they were white and looked like us and were wonderful people. But we tend to think of them as, well, they would be the anti-Semites, they would be the bigots, they would be this and that. In point of fact, the Ottoman Empire ruled in which gender differences were allowed and not looked at the way we have a stereotype in our head of how an Islamic world works. And I think I'm going to make a statement that's my opinion. Islamic world works the way it works and pretty reasonably well until it becomes a theocracy. Yeah. And when you become a theocracy, then all of a sudden religious edicts become law, become enforceable with the power of the state behind it. And that in general terms, Gary, throw out a fact to you that I think you'll find interesting, because we talked before and we had a little bit of a disagreement that I do not think of Islam through history as anti-Semitic. And one of the elements to me that makes that case is, I think anti-Semitism is a birthright, is born in Europe. And it is born more particularly in Eastern Europe. But then it spreads throughout Europe. That probably if we go pre-20th century and say, what's the most horrific anti-Semitic event? We could look at the Dreyfus Affair, but I think it's the Inquisition. And can we agree on that? Okay. When the Inquisition happened, Jews fled from Western Europe. Where did they go? They went to Muslim countries, because the Muslim countries accepted them and they were okay there. I think what has happened, and I don't want to get into a debate here because it's time consuming, I think what you will find when you are dealing with the 20th century history of relationship between Islam and Jews and then Israelis is an anti-Zionist anger and opposition, and not an. There's a large overlap between anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. I'm trying to make a distinction and say it's anti-Zionist as opposed to strictly anti-Semitic. It's it is a point that I know is arguable.
And one led to the other, I would argue.
Yeah. And we can argue it later.
That's an interesting premise for a whole night's debate.
And for more time, unfortunately, than I can give it, but I'm not uncomfortable having it. I just don't think we have the time to do that at this momento. Okay. So how did the Ottoman Empire become this dying man? And we prefaced it earlier, They were not part of the Industrial Revolution, and they fell behind economically and militarily, and they couldn't compete. And empires are costly. There's infrastructure to maintain. There's lines of authority to maintain. There's a military to maintain. And so they are economically behind the eight ball. And what do you do when you're economically behind the eight ball? You borrow money. And largely they borrowed money from European banks. And then debt payments came due, and they couldn't pay them. So what do? Do you default and collapse? Europe doesn't want you to default and collapse because they like your being an anchor there, holding the order in place. Even if you're not strictly able to do it by yourself, we'll keep you afloat. But we'll do it at a price. And we talked in earlier months about the capitulation system. The capitulation system was European businesses, European entrepreneurs would have special economic privileges in your country and legal privileges. You can't prosecute a Frenchman or an Englishman for a crime. We'll take him home, and if we think he needs to be prosecuted, we'll prosecute him. We are demanding those rights based on you owe us money and you can't pay. And then you incur more debt, and you incur more debt. And then they say, and you know what? We would like a seat on the board of that government agency that oversees your economic policy. And then that seat on the board becomes a veto seat in which we can say, no, that policy is unacceptable in terms of British interests, in terms of French interests, in terms of whatever European country's interests. So we'd like to run that policy. In your foreign policy, we have problems with that. Can we have a seat on that board? And little by little, you begin to have these Ottoman satellites with shadow European governments having a lot of say over what goes on in them. And this is wonderful for the European empires because they don't have the cost of imperial infrastructure and they got a lot of the benefits. This is really good. And then as oil is discovered, well, that's going to be another thing that we can exploit and control. So we'd like the Ottomans to stay on their feet for as long as we can keep them there, because that benefits us in ways that going in and colonizing them would not. Besides which, colonization is already beginning to get a bad name, and they don't want to appear like we're colonizers. We're in there as businessmen helping modernize and etc. And which gets us. Did the Ottomans want something from the Europeans besides debt forgiveness? Yeah, please help us to modernize. That's what we want. If you can help us to modernize, then we can get out from under this debt load. Then we can become the great power that we once were. Then we won't be the dying man of Europe. We'll be a strong, viable empire. Again, help us do that. But they're being crippled, not helped. Money, yeah.
Any thoughts on why the Ottoman Empire fell behind in the Industrial Revolution?
No, I don't. I haven't thought about that. That is the next important question. Thank you. Do you have any ideas on it?
Not really.
Yeah, I do know. I remember Bernard Lewis wrote a book, and the Ottoman Empire was a powerful military empire. And the West developed the rifle, and the Ottomans did not. And all of a sudden, balance of power just shifted. They won all. Europe was afraid of the Ottoman Empire, afraid they were going to take more and more territory.
They made it all the way to Vienna, right?
Yeah, they did. And they were thinking they were going to go further. And a rifle is more powerful than a sword. It's like the Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
You have a whip, and I take out my gun and I shoot you. It's just not a fair fight. Yeah. So next month is on the Ottoman Empire. That's all I'm doing on the Ottoman Empire here. That is a 2-minute, really simplified story. And I want to tell more of the story, but not tonight. So the British, the French, they were happy with what they were getting from the Ottoman Empire at low cost, relatively speaking. What were their fears? They had two fears, and they're both the same fear. The Germans now were beginning to make incursions into the Ottoman economic world. They were building a railroad from Anatolia to Baghdad. They were looking at oil fields and potential oil sites. I want to make a slight statement here. Oil was important by time of World War I, but not as important as it is today. So it's not the major driving force, but it's everyone knows it's going to be. They're afraid of that because the Germans are not the British and French allies. And the British and French are only friends because they don't like the Germans and they don't like the Russians together. Britain and France have a long history of not liking each other and of the whole cycle of wars that went on forever. But at this point, we're friends because it suits our imperial interests to be friends. Okay.
Mhm.
The second fear, and the greater fear than that, it was the Russians who were going to move in. When we did the thing on oil, we mentioned America was the first country to really develop mass production, pulling oil out of the ground. And America was the leader in the oil industry, and John D. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world. And then they discovered oil in Russia, and Russia surpassed the United States. So Russia's already number one in the world in terms of oil production. If the Ottoman Empire collapses, it's a swift move for Russia to come sweep off into Mesopotamia and potentially take their dominance of that industry and make it beyond any other nation's ability to compete. And that's a great fear. But there's also another fear, and this is one of the main reasons that Britain is so intent on controlling Palestine and Mesopotamia. For as far as the British are concerned, Middle East has some benefits to it, but they're not great. It's India. It's our holdings in East Africa. They're the real place where we're doing real well in terms of financially benefiting the empire. If you control Palestine and Mesopotamia, you are now a strategic threat to the Suez Canal. You are now a strategic threat to both all the important land and water routes to India. And if you said the British referred to India as the jewel in the crown. That was the most important holding they had. That was their colony. That was the one that mattered to them. And control of this area of the Middle East, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Palestine, that is a protection for our holdings in East Africa and India. And so that is a major reason for fighting, for moving World War I into the Middle East. Again, the fear either of Russia much more than Germany, but Russia or Germany gaining strategic hold on territory that could threaten their other colonies. If the Middle East gave them nothing but a buffer that protected India and Kenya and the East African holdings, I think they were okay. I think they were okay. It's going to give much more. The oil reserves there are going to flood the world, glut the world with oil. and they will want to have control over that. And also, we talked about this the other month when we were talking about oil. The British Navy is transitioning over to an oil navy. England has zero oil. The only oil they have is the oil reserves that they can control in Persia, Iran, or Mesopotamia. And they are going to fight tooth and nail because that's the future. If any of you have seen the movie Chinatown, it's about water there, not oil. But Gittes, the Jack Nicholson character, says to John Huston character, "You're an old man. Why do you care about this? It's the future, Gittes. It's the future. Oil is the future." And excuse me, Churchill knows that. And he is going to be very adamant that that Great Britain is going to have a lock on some of that oil. Otherwise, they cannot compete. Otherwise, their empire fizzles and dies. Okay. I'm going to take us now into the war itself. And just so everybody is aware, I am not at all interested in military history. And if you are interested in it, you won't get any of it from me. I'm interested in the consequences of wars. I'm interested in the consequences of ideas. Those are the things that interest me. To the degree that a little understanding of military history helps you see why certain things happen, I'm okay with. But going beyond that, what general said what to what other general doesn't matter to me. So that is my bias. Okay. If we think about World War I, if I said to you, give me one photograph, one picture that tells you that is most revelatory of World War I, 99% of the world will go to the Western Front and trench warfare. And we won't think of World War I in the Middle East except as a sideshow to the main event, which is what is happening on the Western Front. All of us in high school, or many of us in high school, had to read All Quiet on the Western Front because that is World War I as far as we are concerned. That's where the war was happening. Well, it wasn't just happening there. But it's not just that we, retrospectively, looking back on it, think that way. At the time, the war on the Western Front was so tragic, so devastating, so terrible that it was almost the only thing that a British citizen or a French citizen could think about. In that same book, The War in Modern Memory, that I told the story about the machine gun encampment, he indicated in England, 3/4, and I'm not going to remember the exact age gap range, but of men in the 20 to 25 range, that's ballpark, right? It might have been 18 to 24, whatever it was, but that's ballpark it, were casualties of the war. That's 3/4. The impact of losses like that, not just emotional, but in terms of building the future nation, you've lost a lot of husbands or men who were going to be husbands who aren't going to be husbands.
That includes wounded, right?
I'm sorry?
That includes wounded, right?
Yes. But very
Well,
traumatically.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, but that's a stunning number.
A lot of it.
Yeah. And I always think World War II, one of the first stories you learn is how fast France collapsed. They couldn't face, I think, are we going to do this again? It's not doable. It's not acceptable. And that's where England wanted to put their efforts, because that was the war as far as they were concerned also. But the Ottomans sided with the Germans and entered the war. And all of a sudden, an Eastern Front was created. Now, here's the problem. That's where the Russians are. The Russians can zoom in there unimpeded by any other competing force like a British army or whatever, and they can take everything. The possession is 9/10 of the law. Hey, they could be there. In World War II, they were in Czechoslovakia with a promise to leave. The war ended and they said, hey, you know what? We're not going to leave.
Yeah.
And the British and the Americans largely had to say, you're getting out. And they forced them out. But they were there and they were going to stay. Well, and in World War One, the war in the Middle East ends, and the British Army hasn't reached Mosul, which is reputed to be potentially one of the biggest oil fields that will be found. The oil's not been found yet, but all the geologists are saying this is a major find. They fought 2 more days just to get to Mosul because they knew planting the flag there and being there and having an army station there means, at least for right now, you got it. So they need to be in here. Now, here's the second part of this. And it's a thing about the arrogance of empires. They weren't worried about the Turkish army, the Ottoman army. It's an unprofessional, ineffective army. What do you think? 2 days and we'll knock them out? All right, 3 or 4 days. But it's going to be easy. And there won't be many casualties because they're stumble bums and we're a professional army. And then they get into the Battle of Gallipoli. And it's a tragic disaster. It's awful. The casualties are mounting and mounting and mounting, and they can't win it.
Stupid question, where's Gallipoli?
Sorry?
Where?
It's in Turkey.
Okay.
Yeah. On a peninsula. And it is a bloody affair. And then there is a siege of, it's called a place called Kut, K-U-T. I've never heard of it before, but that's, it was, the British army was trapped, a siege was laid, and they had to surrender thousands of their men to the Turks. And they are looking at the Middle East now as a battlefield and saying, we're mired down. We got the Western Front, we're mired down. We've got the Eastern Front, we're mired down. We can't afford to be mired down on 2 fronts. I mean, one of the things that we have said about World War II, little military history here, is that one of the biggest mistakes that Hitler made was trying to fight a war on 2 fronts. It's a whole lot easier to fight a war on 1 front. The British are stuck. Now, this is going to get into Arab and Israel and Jewish. It's not Israeli yet, because that doesn't happen until 48. And I will, at some point, say Jewish and sometimes say Israeli when I mean one or the other, but I think you will understand that I just make those speech mistakes. But we have promises made to Jews that we will allow them a homeland. But if we're going to beat the Turks, we need the Arabs on our side. The Jews aren't going to make a big difference in that fight. The Arabs potentially could. We need to negotiate with them. We've mentioned the McMahon-Hussein correspondence in which Britain promised that the Arabs would be allowed a self-determination, the creation of an independent Arab state. That's in direct contradiction to we will help the Jews establish a homeland, because if you leave it up to self-determination, during World War I, probably 90% of the population is Arab. That percentage will decrease slowly with Jewish migration, but probably 70-30 is about as good as it's going to get.
You're talking about Palestine.
Yes. And if you allow self-determination, the Arabs have the votes. It will not be a Jewish state. It just won't. That's just a given. Okay. So Gallipoli and Kut are 2 important battles that we do not necessarily talk much about, but they changed the history of the Middle East. they created a complication that would help to intensify Arab and Jewish animosities towards each other in the region. And that is kind of understating it. Okay, what I want to look at now is the relative strength of British support for Zionism. And I'm being careful here. I'm going to make a distinction here. The second thing is not their anti-Zionist attitudes, but rather their willingness to support an Arab self-determination to create an independent state, because you can't do both.
Well, not in Palestine, but there's other parts of the Ottoman, like the Arab Ottoman Empire.
And we're going to talk about, there's a Weizmann Faisal agreement that is signed, and essentially they want to make either Syria or parts of Mesopotamia a great Arab state.
And there's Transjordan, which is also kind of disputed, I guess.
Yes, and that's again, I think Faisal has an idea of a huge Arab state, but they could certainly have carved out something. But that's Europeans making decisions for other peoples, which they're very comfortable doing. But at any rate, so I want to look at the pro-Zionist positions of England, of Britain. You got to start with the Balfour Declaration. David Balfour writes this letter, and it is the anchor on which all Zionist Jews place their certainty that they had the right to create a homeland in Palestine. And essentially, again,
Well, more, I would say more that Britain would support their cause, because there's Theodore Herzl long before that, but that was when the Balfour Declaration was when they said, okay, Britain's got it back.
absolutely. And at this point, Britain is a great imperial power. They can push things to happen.
Right.
At any rate, the Balfour Declaration itself is ambiguous. It says, we view with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland or national homeland for the Jews in Palestine, and we'll endeavor to do what we can to assist them in this project. ... The next sentence says, unless it impinges on or prejudices the civil and religious rights of other groups already there. Well, if you are going to create a Jewish state in Palestine, it will impinge on and prejudice the civil and religious rights of the Arabs who are living there. And so the Balfour Declaration says, we offer you this, but we can't really do it, and still stay true to what the Balfour Declaration says. So there is that. But again, that is part of England had short-term strategic and political needs, and to meet those short-term political needs, they will make a promise. And then if those short-term political or military needs change, we'll make a different promise. And if that causes us discomfort and problems, we'll make a different promise. And there's a lot of different promises made here because that's what they do. Second, Chaim Weizmann was a chemist who lived in England, and he was in charge of producing acetone. Acetone was essential to the war effort. It's the propellant for bullets and artillery shells. You can't fight a war without what he does, and he's really good at his job, and he is overproducing what they expect from him, and he has given many medals and given positions in government. He's really important. He's also one of the leading Zionists in the world. After Herzl, he will become the head of the World Zionist Organization. So you have in England a major proponent of Zionism. And in fact, he's the one who spoke to Balfour and said, you got to write this letter. He was also connected to and friendly with David Lloyd George, who will be the second prime minister in the World War I era. and has his ear and has a lot of influence. In addition, there's a man named Herbert Samuel, who is one of the first Jews to be in the cabinet. He will later be named the High Commissioner of Palestine, the head government official, British official there, who is also a very, very strong Zionist. So you have, whether or not you have a majority, you have some powerful individuals pushing for the Zionist agenda, and they have the ears of government, and government is listening and responding positively to their demands or their requests, however you want to phrase it. So you've got that going on. So there is real energy for Zionism. That does not mean that England is a pro-Zionist country. It means they have members within the power elite who are looking very favorably towards the establishment of what would become Israel. Okay.
But she also be noted, they said like a national home, not explicitly a national state.
You're right. Yeah. And as diplomats, we parse words and we deter at one.
As did Theodore Herzl originally.
Yes. And he didn't say Palestine originally either. And actually one of the first places offered, there was a place in Latin America and there was also in Uganda. But that's taking us a little bit afield.
So are you
Yeah.
basically saying that, let me see, I'll have to go back and read, but are you basically saying that I can write something up and it can be, and I don't have to really follow through on it? It's just my paper to get us through to the next phase.
I can make as many promises as I need to
Right?
make.
So I can write it up.
Yeah.
And so as long as I can use that to get to the next phase,
Oh.
it doesn't matter what I say.
While they're doing this, they're negotiating the Sykes-Picot agreement between England and France. And
I
it,
just find it
it
amazing.
negates all the promises.
I mean, I just find it amazing, and all I keep thinking of is King saying, just be true to what you put on paper.
Yep.
But you're not, I mean, it's like nobody's true to what they put on paper.
Yeah.
No.
There's an
I mean,
old saying.
it's-
There's an old saying. I'm not sure it's entirely a fair saying, but there's an old saying, "Perfidious Albion," which basically means deceitful Britain.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
but it's not just them, it's those who are on the receiving end. Because if I'm writing something and it's deceitful and you're taking it, you know it's deceitful, right? Or you don't know.
I think they can, that it might happen.
Okay, I'm just trying to
Yeah.
put my head where their heads are,
Right.
trying to understand.
Or at least it gives them ammunition as they go to argue for it to
Yeah.
happen.
And you can
Okay.
argue it did happen for both sides, but not to the degree that they wanted. The Jews probably wanted more land than they got, and the Arabs got Transjordan, but they wanted a lot more than that.
Yeah, but they also didn't get immediate independence. They had to go through the
Yeah.
mandate years, and so that they didn't. We've already been a colony essentially. Why should we become a colony for somebody else now?
Yeah.
No, please. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No,
I'm
no,
just
no,
trying to
no.
understand.
It is a point worth underscoring. Okay. And then I'm going to make a judgment as to which side they favored more. Second was, and I'm being careful here, did they, well, how strong, what was their support for the Arab right of self-determination? And again, if we give the Arabs the right of self-determination, and that's one of the things that Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points essentially said we should do, they're 90% of the population. It's not a Jewish state. It just isn't. The votes will not be there. They will create, you almost don't need to have an election to know the outcome, because it will be that outcome. Okay. Their support has some relative strength to it because they don't need the Jewish support in the war to nearly the extent that they need Arab support.
Especially not in the Middle Eastern theater. There are hardly any Jews there.
Yep. And Gallipoli just took the wind out of their sails. They're really uncertain about how this is going to proceed. They will then connect with Sharif Hussein, who is the caliph of Mecca and Medina,
Mm.
very powerful places. He's not an Arab leader. He's not the head of Arab nationalism, although he proclaims himself to be. His son is the Faisal that we were talking about last week, and we're going to go a little more into what he did because it's really, really important. But what they want to do, and they will end up working with the son Faisal, and what they want is an Arab revolt. We want you to use the Arabs, guerrilla warfare, whatever it might be, just cause enough trouble for the Ottomans that you're a pain in their side. But that's not our main idea. Our main idea is if you make a call for an Arab revolt, the Arabs in the Ottoman army are going to desert en masse. And all of a sudden, the Ottoman army is desolate. It just doesn't have the forces to do what it needs to do. Were there some desertions? Yes, not many. There are arguments about how effective the Arab revolt was in terms of its military actions. I think most people say they were not really that effective. Other people are more generous in their estimates. Part of the problem there is the liaison with the Arabs was T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and he was a magnet for the world's attention. He was a romantic hero, a romanticized hero, and he was the leader in his flowing robes of the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Turks. And so the stories kind of get exaggerated about some of their claims, I suspect, but that is there. By the way, we mentioned this man Faisal last week, and we'll talk more about him here today. He's in the movie Lawrence of Arabia.
Really?
Alec Guinness.
Really?
That's him.
I got to rewatch the movie.
Yeah, I was going to say rewatch the movie, and the historical accuracy of that film is in question. But nonetheless, it'd be interesting after what we've been talking about and what we're going to talk about to see it and see how they presented it.
Yeah.
Now, if you said to me, were the British more likely to support a pro-Zionist or a pro-Arab self-determination, I think over time in history, they lied to both, broke promises to both, but there was more energy on the pro-Zionist side. They never really were in favor of an independent Arab nation.
So let me throw this out here just to
Okay.
put a thought out there. Is that because of race?
They thought of them as incompetence, as corrupt. Absolutely. That was and what is the working definition of a mandate as opposed to a colony? The working definition is you're not capable of governing yourself yet. We will guide you along, and when you're ready, we'll set you free.
And it was like also authorized by the League of Nations, right?
Yes, that's going to be very important. I'm going to hold off on that because that's a real important point.
Were there any independent Arab or Muslim states apart from the Ottomans?
Saudi Arabia was essentially
Right.
independent.
Did they have any role in or any say in what's going on back then?
They were a challenger to Hussein in his claim to be the spokesman for Arab nationalism. But at that point, Saudi Arabia is not real powerful. They haven't gotten their oil yet. And it's a handful of warlords. The leader of them, Saud, would eventually form the family that brought Saudi Arabia to real power, but they're not a power right
So-
here.
Okay, and forgive my
No.
ignorance, please. Are you saying the whole Arab world or Muslim world was controlled by the Ottomans and then later the Brits?
British and the French.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even Egypt? Morocco, what about Northern Africa?
Northern Africa is French.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the British have been in control of Egypt since the 1880s. Kind of sub rosa. I mean, it was technically still part of the Ottoman Empire, but the British directed policy.
in Iran, or maybe it was called Persia. but
Persia.
Under the same,
Yes. No, they might have been independent. I think Persia was independent.
what about, well, again, Pakistan, that was the British and.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was still part of British India.
right, right.
Yeah.
right. Okay.
Can I make a
Absolutely.
case that the British didn't favor the Zionists?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So the obvious exception would be beginning with the Balfour Declaration, but as you said, it was a very hedged declaration. We'll create a national home for the Jews, not a sovereign state, not a state, a national home, and nothing will be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing population. So clearly it's an olive branch to the Jews, but it's not decisively saying Britain is going to create a state. So that would be the beginning. And then as we talked about, they made these deals with the Arabs as well, saying we're going to grant you self-determination. You do the Arab revolt, we'll grant you self-determination. But as you said, they also made promises to the Jews. So but then if you look, some of this extends past World War I, so pardon me for that. But if you look after World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate for Palestine, and I'd be interested in, I don't remember what the terms of that mandate were, but they granted them the mandate for Palestine. So my main case that they didn't favor the Zionists is it seems, I would argue that they favored the status quo in Palestine after receiving their mandate. At least they favored the status quo.
Who's the status quo?
Basically, that the Arabs there were some Jews, but the Arabs were dominant in
So
Palestine.
if they favored the status quo, then what did the Arabs get?
Nothing. Neither the Jews nor the Arabs really got anything until the War of Independence kind of settled it.
I'm
But-
making a fine point, and I can see where it's maybe not. It is that there was some energy, some real believers in Zionism among the elites in England. There was almost nobody who really wanted an independent Arab state. They wanted to favor the Arabs because they needed the Arabs' help, but they didn't want them to get that independent state when it was over. That's why I was not phrasing it pro-Zionist and anti-Zionist.
Right.
Are they pro-Zionist? Some energy is there. Do they really want the Arabs to have an independent state? I don't think they do.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And put the French in there too. The French really didn't want them to.
Yeah, so I know some, as I said, some of this extends past World War I, and it may be a different conclusion who they favored if you limit it to just the Balfour Declaration and World War I. But if you extend it forward into the mandate period, where they had the mandate for Palestine, I would argue that they kind of didn't, they favored the status quo. They didn't want either that, they didn't want to certainly didn't want to extend the Arabs' domination of Palestine, but they also didn't want the Jews to become dominant in Palestine, hence like famously limiting heavily limiting
Yes.
Jewish immigration, because they didn't want the Jews to completely change the population dynamics. So, and I would argue that yes, there eventually a Jewish state was established, but that was partly because events got away from them for a few reasons. First, like both legal and illegal Jewish immigration changed the population of Palestine, and then there was a partition plan in the UN. I don't know if that was part of the mandate or not, but eventually there was a partition plan in the UN, and it was supposed to be divided between the Arab and Jewish states. But and then of course, like the Jews declared independence, the Jews won the war. But I would argue that Britain didn't deliver Palestine to the Jews on a silver platter, saying, "Here, have a state."
And
It kind of the events kind of got away from Britain. They favored the
absolutely agree with you. And
When you say favor the status quo, who is the status quo?
The status quo, yeah, the status quo after Britain got control of the mandate for Palestine, the status quo would basically be Britain ruling over Palestine as a colony, the Arabs and most of the population being Arab with some Jews, with Britain in charge.
Yeah. I'm just
One thing I want to respond to,
Yeah.
the comment that the British turned over that land to anybody.
No, I said they did.
I would
they
say
did
it
not turn
differently.
over
I would
the
say the
silver
British
platter.
left, and they left a void, and that's how come we have nothing but constant conflict since they left.
Now, I want to just pull it back to World War I period
Mm.
and the peace conference. The great debate over Palestine. I'm trying to be clear here. I don't think the British wanted to establish a Jewish homeland. I think they also didn't want to establish an independent Arab state. But if you said which one had more energy, those in favor. And here's my quote proof of that, or at least that the Jews felt that. The debate over what would happen in the Palestine mandate was it would either be run by an international commission or as a British mandate. And the Jews fought heavily to make it a
Yeah, I
British
guess.
mandate
Thanks.
because they knew an international commission, or believed an international commission, would never make it even remotely possible to have a Jewish state. Whereas with a British mandate, the possibility was there because there were people among the elite who might help push them in that direction.
Yeah, the
That's
Jews-
as opposed to saying, we want a Jewish state.
Yeah, the Jews definitely had high hopes for Britain, but I argue those hopes were not delivered.
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm with you 100% there on that.
But could you say that again? I didn't get it.
I said the Jews had high hopes that Britain would give them a state, but they did not actually do that. Britain never quote unquote gave them a state.
Got it.
Britain was not
Agreed.
delivering. Okay, I'm going to move us forward here. And we'll talk about the Sykes-Picot, and we don't need to talk about it a lot because we've talked about it before. This was a secret agreement, a secret series of negotiations saying, whatever we're promising other people, this is what we really want to do. Okay? Don't tell anyone. Part of the problem is Russia was originally involved in it, and the Bolsheviks, going through papers, found the agreement and published it and said, the British are lying to you. They're lying to everybody.
Published what?
The Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was, because Russia's out of it, England and France agreeing this is how we're going to divide up the territories. And there's not going to be a Jewish state, and there's not going to be an Arab state. It's going to be French mandates and British mandates. That's what it's going to be. But that was a secret. And it comes out, and now the Jews are angry at the British and the French, and the Arabs are angry at the British and the French because they're lying to them both. Okay. This isn't maybe important historically, but it's interesting historically. There's the King Crane Commission. The King Crane Commission is basically an American commission. It had a British partner who pulled out, but all they wanted to do was go and talk. What do you guys want? How would you like to see these issues resolved? Well, I mean, just highlight 90% of the people who spoke to them said, we oppose Zionism. Not a surprise. 90% of the population is Arab. Asked, would you prefer Britain or France? France was hated more than the British. I've been damning the British. When the French get in there, they are much more brutal in terms of how they run their mandates than the British are. And the Arabs have already know this is what's coming their way. They do not want the French. And there's a religious element here. One of the reasons that France wants kind of Lebanon, Syria area, there's Christian populations there. And they say, we are the protectors of Christians in the world. So we should be in there. Okay. And then the other thing, just an interesting anecdote, especially in the light of 9/11 and other things that have happened since, they said, if we have to, first off, back off for a second. We already had a master. We don't want to go from one master to another. Second of all, the master we had was Islamic. We would probably rather have an Islamic master than a Christian master. I mean, if we got to be somebody's thrall, Islam is our religion. Third, if we got to choose, we'd take the Americans. Because the Americans had not shown in the eyes of the people in the Middle East an imperialistic, I mean, we could argue this, but they didn't see them as imperialists. And in point of fact, what they saw them as is the people who came to the rescue of the poor Armenians who were being slaughtered. And so they gave a lot of kudos to America in there. All right, I'm going to get off of that. And we're getting to the post-war years. What is actually going to happen? Sykes-Picot. The British and the French have no legal authority to do that. Here's how we're going to divide the territory. They're not your territories to divide. So they got to find a way to implement it. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson creates, and this is the point I was going to get with you, Matthew, create or puts forward the idea of a League of Nations. The United States won't join it, but it gets built. And now the French and the British are able to say, "Oh, we're going to give you the Sykes-Picot Agreement. You can't be accused of being an imperialist force. You're an international organization meant to keep the peace. You decide the issue the way we wanted you to decide it, but you decide it." Now it no longer looks like the British are saying, "We want this," and the French are saying, "We want that." It's the the League of Nations saying, the best way to work this out is for there to be a British mandate here and a French mandate there. And so now it seems like it's not an imperialist move. And so they're very happy to have that taint removed from them.
But now ostensibly these mandates were temporary,
Yes. Oh, yes.
but temporary things can become permanent.
More often than not, they do. Or permanent for a long time, then things fall apart because things fall apart too. That's the other thing about the world. But anyway, the League of Nations legitimizes Sykes-Picot, and they pretty much follow Sykes-Picot down the line. What they will do is they will punt and say, we're going to create a commission called the San Remo Conference, and they'll decide the issues there. They're going to essentially implement Sykes-Picot. The only debate, as we were just talking about earlier, is that mandate in Palestine is the hot potato. That's the one where there's going to be the most political arguments and trouble. A way to diffuse that might be to make it an international commission to administrate the area, or it'll be a British mandate. And generally speaking, Jewish Zionists pushed for Britain. With all the lies, with all the problems, with everything else, they felt there was a potential, there are elements of support within the British high powers that they might get this. Okay. I'm going to go back to the Paris Peace Conference. We were talking last month about Faisal talking to the peace conference and offering basically a deal allowing a Jewish homeland to be created in Palestine, but balanced out by having an independent Arab state created. And the conference rejects it. There's another piece to the story. And you remember Chaim Weizmann, the head of the World Zionist Organization. Herzl is gone. He meets with Faisal, and they write up and sign an agreement. And I wrote down the pieces of it. This is what we agree to. And again, Faisal is calling himself the leader of Arab nationalists. That's self-proclaimed. Doesn't really have that power, but at least he's an Arab representative. Both agree to reject Sykes-Picot. We don't want a mandate system. The mandate system is just colonialism by another name. It's just the superpowers of that day continuing their power and their ability to exploit the Middle East and the coming oil reserves. Okay, so we agree on that. 2, we agree that that the Jews can create a homeland in Palestine. Faisal says he will respect the rights of the Jews to Palestine. Undecided yet are the boundaries. Those are to be determined, but this is an initial agreement. Big agreement. Faisal agrees to allow 5 million Jewish immigrants into Palestine. That's a very large number at this point. That would give the Jewish population in Palestine a much larger stake, a much stronger position, and leverage to accomplish what they want to accomplish there. These are really big concessions. They also, Weizmann agrees that the Arab farmers there, their rights will be protected. They're not going to be thrown off the land. They own property. It's theirs. They can work it. They can live it. They can do it. This is what we're agreeing to. And then the Zionists say, or Weizmann says, the Zionists will send experts to work with Faisal and other international brokers, power brokers, to work out the plans for establishing an independent Arab state. If you think about it, it's logical because Zionists have been planning for decades how they would create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, take those same ideas and skills and expertise, and we'll give them to the Arabs so that they can have the benefit of our years of thinking about this question, and it will be an easier transition to make. I do not look at this with rose-colored glasses and say this was the solution. I do say it had some legitimacy because it has and they sign it, Weizmann and Faisal, because Weizmann is a significant person in the British government and the leader of the World Zionist Organization. And Faisal right now is being recognized by the West, not necessarily by the Arabs, as the leader of the Arab people. And it might have been something in 1920, 1919, 1918, the animosity between Jews and Arabs was real, but it's going to get worse. Would this have been a moment where something could have been? Again, no rose-colored glasses here. This plan could have failed, but I think it is interesting that this was on the table with signatures saying we agree to this, of people who matter within the conflict of that time. Would it have worked? Don't know. But the peace conference shut it down because they weren't interested in an independent Arab state, and they were ready to create this mandate system, which they were going to do and did do. Okay. I'm at the end of the story. At the end of the story is the sad ending. Immediately after the mandate for Palestine is established, there's an Arab uprising. They will not accept that mandate. They look at the allowance for immigration of 5 million Jews, because that's been agreed to in part of the mandate. They look at that and say, that will change everything. We cannot allow that. We cannot live that. We will not accept that. And there is a violent uprising, most of it happening in Haifa. There's about 100 people who are going to get killed and about 300 wounded, half Jews, half Arabs. And what is the British response? Herbert Samuel, the Jew who was in the British cabinet and is now the High Commissioner of Palestine, says, we're revoking the Balfour Declaration. We are not going to impose a Jewish state on a majority Arab population, and we're going to shut down or at least limit the valve of immigration going on. Churchill will publish a white paper in which he formalizes this and says, Balfour is over, the immigration plans are over. And what we are doing is setting the stage for more than a century of Arab and Jewish, Arab and Israeli fights, wars, terrorist attacks, whatever it is going to be. All the pieces are in place right now for the history that's going to happen. We have the benefit of looking backwards and saying, we know how this story ends or doesn't end. We can see where it's going. And because if you tell the Jews we're shutting off the valve on immigrants and we're revoking Balfour, you got a war on your hand with the Jews. If you tell and this is what is going to be crazy during the 20s and 30s, the Jewish response to shutting off immigration is going to be angry. And the British are going to say, okay, we'll open up the valve on immigration. Then the Arabs will respond, wait a minute, you can't do that. Okay, we'll close down the valve. Until finally Britain abdicates. But you see, what I'm saying here is, I think World War I set the table for all the Arab-Israeli conflicts that we have lived through in our life. it's been set up here.
Mm.
It's ready to go. And that is where I stop.
Well, that gives us a lot to think about, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'll say.
Yeah, because but this is what I don't understand, and I really don't know that much about the history of it. But if you're creating these states for people physically, right? Geographically, did they decide who was going to be where? I mean, if I'm bringing in 5 million people, they got to go somewhere.
Yeah, just into Palestine. Yeah.
But aren't they dividing?
It's not being partitioned.
It's not being, so we're all going to live here together.
Yep.
Oh, it's not being divided
But on the
geographically.
other hand, when they try to create states, whether it's in Africa or the Middle East or India and Pakistan, they don't worry about who's living where. They draw
just-
lines on a map and say, this is a country,
Okay.
even if it doesn't have any viability as a country. Half of the problems that Africa has gone through in the 20th century
Oh,
are the result of all these civil wars because you drew lines on maps that didn't make sense with the people who lived there.
but wouldn't you, if you were saying, if I'm having this amount of people come in, right?
Mhm.
And you're saying, I mean, I don't know how many Arabs are there, but it's like, well, look, if we're going to create these two states, well, they have to have people too. They can't have a state and they don't have anybody. So
Yeah.
we have to have some people here
There's
and some people here.
about 700,000 Arabs in Palestine at this point and tens of thousands of Jews.
Okay.
I don't know the exact number there, but the Jews
Sure.
represent somewhere around 10% of the population by
Okay.
World War I, and
Mhm.
it's going to increase, I think, as high as 30%.
Okay.
But
So they really didn't have people really sitting down and really hitting through stuff because you have someone who isn't even really respected by the Arab nations.
I think they were reactionary. If a problem came up and one side was angry, they tried to appease that side.
Okay.
And when that side was appeased, the other side wasn't.
Mhm.
And they went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And they never really made,
Is it because they don't have the right people sitting around the table? I mean, because you
That's
can't have
part of
someone
it, I don't know.
negotiate. You can't have someone negotiate that isn't respected by their own people.
well,
You can't do it.
just one point, and I'll let you in, Matthew. When they set up the state of Iraq, they named Faisal the king of Iraq. Faisal never lived in Iraq in his life. He was also a Sunni Muslim. The
Oh.
people of Iraq were largely Shia Muslim. That doesn't go together. He was also viewed as a British puppet. How did they expect that to work?
Yeah.
It just,
It
it
doesn't.
had no possibility of working.
Hmm.
It just didn't. You anyone want to say something, Matthew?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you're right that part of it was that the Arabs didn't have a good representative at the table, and I've even heard, I don't know the details, I don't remember the details, I'm not even 100% sure, but I've heard that I think it was Faisal like didn't actually, I think he was sent with instructions, this is from his father, this is the red line, don't give away any more than this, don't let them have any further
Mhm.
concessions, and he went beyond that line, and I've heard partly because he didn't know what he was signing because he didn't speak English and it wasn't translated properly.
Yeah, but there's also he and his father came to blows with each other. The father felt he was being betrayed by the son, and that he was being a puppet of the English.
Mm.
So, well, anyone else have any other comments? If not, we will say thank you all very much.
It's very interesting.
This
Okay,
is very
thanks.
interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and
Thank you,
we're
Mike.
going to be discussing World War I for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
just-
great.
Cool.
I've been coming here very sporadically, but this was a 2-year topic?
It is a 2-year
Your
topic. This
theme?
is the first year.
Oh, okay, that's what I was.
Yeah. So next year I'm going to cheat next year a little bit just because I want to do it. I want to look at France and Algeria. When I set the parameters, I said up to 1948.
For the end of the whole
Yeah,
theme.
but I want to do Algeria
Okay.
Oh, yes, let's. do
and
it.
that post 48, but I want to do it. And since I'm doing it,
Yeah.
The date of next month.
it's going to change a week later. It says March 19th. It'll be March 26th. All right, everybody, thank you very, very much. And don't
Have
work
a
too
good
hard.
month.
Thank you, Jackie.
Have a good month.
Very interesting. It's a
Take
shame
care,
that
everybody.
people don't
Enjoy.
Yep.
Good month.
All right.
Take care.
Take care.
Yep. Take care, everybody.
All right, bye.
This is my first time driving here. Boy, that road gets really crowded. That's
See,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
never come down.
Right
here.
here, yeah, that's.
I've never.
Are you, you live right in
You
Williamstown?
just walk over and my goodness gracious, I was like, what is going on here?
And it with the rain.